Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in American history. This story unfolds in 1912, deep within the shadowy Ozarks of Missouri, and what you are about to learn may forever alter your trust in strangers after dark. The Ozarks have long carried a distinct notoriety. This vast mountainous region, spanning thousands of square miles across Missouri and Arkansas, was famed for its impenetrable forests, secluded valleys, and remote communities that existed largely outside the reach of formal law. In the early 1900s, when automobiles were still a rarity and most travel depended on horse or wagon, a nighttime journey through the Ozarks was considered ill-advised. This caution stemmed not merely from the threats of bears, snakes, or hidden cliffs obscured by darkness, but from something else intrinsic to those hills, something the local inhabitants seldom spoke of aloud. Webster County, situated in the core of the Missouri Ozarks, was a place where time appeared motionless. Its roads were mere dirt paths that transformed into rivers of mud with the spring rains. Farms lay miles apart, isolated by thick woodlands of oak and hickory. The nearest town of any note was Marshfield, with its modest population of 300, featuring a Baptist church, a general store, and a small sheriff's office, typically manned by only 1 or 2 deputies. In the winter of 1912, the cold arrived prematurely and with severe intensity. By mid-November, the first snowstorms had enveloped the mountains, rendering travel even more perilous. It was against this backdrop that the disappearances commenced, not simultaneously, but slowly, so that it took weeks for anyone to connect the events and recognize a sinister pattern emerging from those snow-clad hills. The first to vanish was Thomas Whitmore, a 42-year-old merchant who routinely traveled from Springfield to Marshfield to deliver goods for the local store. Known for making this trip at least twice monthly with his wagon and 2 sturdy horses, he departed Springfield one November afternoon, intending to reach Marshfield before nightfall. However, sunset comes early in the Ozark winter, around 5 o'clock, and the winding roads invariably prolonged any journey. Thomas never arrived. His wife, Martha, waited 3 days before notifying the sheriff. Delays due to severe weather or wagon trouble were not unusual then, but after a week with no word, Sheriff Henry Bolton assembled a search party. What they discovered roughly 15 miles from Marshfield was disturbing. Thomas's wagon stood abandoned in the middle of the road, its cargo untouched. The horses were missing, but most strangely, there were no signs of a struggle. No bloodstains, no scattered personal effects, no indication of violence. It seemed as if Thomas had simply stepped down from the wagon and walked into the woods, leaving everything behind. Sheriff Bolton inspected the scene meticulously and noted something unsettling. Footprints led from the wagon toward the forest, but only a single set Thomas's progressing straight into the tree line, as if he were following something visible only to him. The searchers traced these prints for nearly a kilometer into the woods. The trail was clear in the fresh snow, but then it abruptly ceased. The tracks ended in the middle of a small clearing with no evidence of dragging, animal activity, climbing, or a fall, as if he had been lifted from the ground by invisible hands. Bolton ordered his men to scour the area, but the vast, unforgiving Ozarks thwarted them. After 2 days of futile searching, with temperatures plunging and another snowstorm approaching, they had to abandon the effort. Martha Whitmore was devastated, yet little could be done. Disappearances in rural areas were often met with grim acceptance of nature's cruelty. Then, merely 10 days later, it happened again, this time to an entire family. The Brennans, a family of 4. Robert, 37, his wife, Eleanor, 33, and their children, 12-year-old Samuel and 7-year-old Emma, lived on a modest farm near Seymour in Webster County. They had decided to visit Eleanor's family in Hartville before Christmas, a day-long wagon journey through some of the Ozark's most isolated stretches. Robert Brennan was a prudent, experienced man familiar with the route. That December, however, something in the mountains felt different. Neighbors later reported seeing the Brennan wagon pass around 2 in the afternoon, with Eleanor waving from beneath the wagon's heavy tarp, the children bundled in blankets. All seemed normal. When the family failed to arrive in Hartville by the next morning, Robert's brother-in-law, James Parker, retraced the road on horseback. He found the wagon parked on the roadside in a secluded area surrounded by tall pines. The horses remained harnessed, but were agitated and nervous. James approached and pulled back the intact tarp to find the family's belongings: suitcases, food baskets, Christmas gifts, undisturbed. Yet the family was gone. Footprints in the partially melted snow showed the tracks of Robert's boots, Eleanor's shoes, and the children's small feet, all leading side by side into the forest, as if they had collectively decided to walk away. This orderly procession filled James with a profound dread. He followed the trail cautiously with his rifle, but after half a mile, the tracks simply stopped in an open area among the pines, as if the Brennans had vanished into the cold air. There were no signs of climbing, animal attack, or struggle. Only an oppressive silence and a growing sense of being watched. James rallied a search party from Hartville, but after 3 days, they found nothing. No trace of the family. Sheriff Bolton was summoned again and could no longer ignore the pattern. 2 incidents in under a month, both following the same macabre script: people vanishing from their wagons after dark, willingly walking into the woods, and then ceasing to exist. Whispers began among locals, tales of strange lights between trees after sunset, of voices mimicking loved ones, of something ancient and hungry awakening in the Ozark's deepest recesses during the darkest winter months. Bolton, a practical man, dismissed superstition, but could not explain the occurrences. Worse was yet to come, for the disappearances were only beginning. News spread rapidly through the isolated Ozark communities via travelers and mail. Within 2 weeks, nearly everyone in Webster County knew of Thomas Whitmore and the Brennans. People began locking doors earlier, avoiding roads after 4 p.m., and the Marshfield General Store started closing at noon in winter. Sheriff Bolton attempted to maintain calm, attributing the events to disorientation from extreme cold, but he privately doubted this theory. The footprint patterns seemed too deliberate. On December 28th, 3 days before New Year's Eve, a 3rd disappearance occurred. Margaret Sullivan, a 29-year-old teacher from Kansas City who taught at a 1-room schoolhouse in Fordland, was riding her mare, Copper, home after classes were dismissed early due to the cold. When she did not return, her landlady sent her 16-year-old son, Daniel, to search. He found Copper wandering near a frozen creek, saddled but riderless and visibly terrified. Daniel traced the horse's tracks back and discovered a confusing scene. Margaret's boot prints accompanied by strange, elongated drag-like marks encircling the spot where she had dismounted. Her footprints led hesitantly into the forest, with the peculiar marks flanking her like an eerie escort. Daniel fetched his father and other men, and they followed the trail with rifles and flashlights. Deep in the woods, they stumbled upon an abandoned camp with still warm ashes under fresh snow. 3 worn canvas tents stood in a circle. Among the ashes, they found Thomas Whitmore's initialed pocket watch, Emma Brennan's teddy bear, and Margaret Sullivan's silver necklace, all discarded like trophies. The tents contained more disturbing items: clothing from unreported victims, unrecognizable tools, and notebooks filled with cryptic symbols and coded entries. One legible English note, dated October 1912, read, "The nights are getting longer, and they are getting hungrier. We can't control them as we used to. William said we should abandon the experiment, but it's too late. They've learned to imitate our voices. I heard my own mother calling me from the woods last night, but my mother died 5 years ago in Philadelphia. They know things they shouldn't know. Mr. Henderson's group collected the evidence and delivered it to Sheriff Bolton. As the sheriff examined the items, the familiar watch, the perfumed teddy bear, the stained necklace, his face paled. But the notebooks, with their time-worn leather covers and pages of frantic handwriting interspersed with chillingly clear entries, truly unsettled him, hinting at a terrifying experiment and entities that defied all rational explanation. They know our names. They know our fears. Another undated entry was even more disturbing. We found the bones today, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, buried in a cave 2 miles north of base camp. Some are ancient, so old they crumble to the touch, but others are recent. I recognize the wedding ring still on the finger of a skeleton that can't be more than a few months old. The marks on the bones suggest they were gnawed on, but not by animals. The teeth that left those marks were human, or something that was human long ago. Sheriff Bolton felt a chill run down his spine. He had served in the Spanish-American War 15 years earlier, had seen men die in horrific ways, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. He continued leafing through the notebooks, finding disturbing sketches of humanoid figures with elongated limbs. Faces that looked almost human, but with subtly flawed features, as if someone were trying to imitate the human form, based only on vague descriptions. One of the last entries, dated December 23, 1912, just 5 days before Margaret Sullivan's disappearance, read, "We can't go out during the day anymore. They surround the camp every night now, whispering our names, imitating the voices of people we love. Jackson tried to escape yesterday. We heard his screams for hours coming from the woods. When dawn came, we found only his boots at the edge of the camp, neatly arranged side by side, as if he had simply stepped out of them and walked barefoot to his death. William is talking about making a pact with them. He says, maybe we can negotiate, offer something in exchange for our lives. But what could we offer to creatures who have already taken everything from us?" Sheriff Bolton closed his notebook with trembling hands. He looked at the men gathered in his small office, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the lamps. They were all tough men, accustomed to the harsh life of the mountains. But at that moment, they seemed like frightened children faced with something they couldn't understand. Mr. Henderson broke the silence. "Sheriff, we need to gather every armed man we can and go back to that camp. If there are people responsible for this, people who are conducting experiments or diabolical rituals in these mountains, we need to stop them before more people disappear." Bolton agreed, but a part of him knew it wouldn't be that simple. The notebook entries suggested that whoever had set up camp wasn't the predators, but other victims. And if that were true, then what was really hunting people in the Ozarks was something far worse than any human criminal. The next morning, December 31, 1912, Sheriff Bolton assembled a group of 23 volunteers, all armed with rifles, shotguns, and revolvers. They brought flashlights, ropes, 3 days' worth of provisions, and all the courage they could muster. The plan was to return to the abandoned camp, track deeper into the forest if necessary, and find out once and for all what was happening in those mountains. They set out from Marshfield at 7 in the morning, under a gray sky thick with clouds that promised more snow. The temperature had dropped further overnight, and the biting northerly wind had the men pulling their coats tighter around them. Mr. Henderson led the group back to the spot where they had found the camp 2 days earlier. The journey took almost 5 hours. Even though they knew the route, the roads were covered in treacherous ice, and at several points they had to dismount and walk through areas where the trees grew so densely that there was barely room to pass. When they finally reached the camp, the sun was already beginning its rapid descent toward the horizon, and everyone knew they had at most 3 hours of daylight left. The camp was exactly as Mr. Henderson and his men had left it, except for one detail that made everyone present freeze in place. The 3 tents that had been erected 2 days earlier were now completely destroyed. The canvas had been ripped to shreds, the wooden structures broken and scattered, and in the center of the circle, where the campfire had burned, someone or something had arranged the debris in a disturbing circular pattern, almost like a symbol or a warning. Sheriff Bolton slowly approached the wreckage, his rifle clutched tightly to his chest. The other men stood in a semicircle behind him, their eyes nervously scanning the surrounding tree line. The forest was too quiet. There was no sound of birds, no rustle of small animals in the snow, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. It was as if all wildlife had abandoned the area, leaving only an oppressive, unnatural void. The pattern on the ground was meticulous. Pieces of torn canvas formed an outer circle approximately 4 meters in diameter. Within it, broken branches from the tent structures were arranged in a star shape, pointing in 6 different directions. And in the absolute center, embedded in the frozen earth, was a piece of carved wood that none of the men recognized as having come from the tents. It was ancient, worn from years of exposure to the elements, with deep carvings that formed symbols that seemed older than any language Bolton knew. One of the men, a farmer named Wesley Drummond, who had lived in the Ozarks all his 56 years, spat on the ground and made the sign of the cross. "My grandfather told me stories about markings like these," he said hoarsely. He said the ancient people who lived in these mountains long before the settlers arrived made signs like these to mark cursed places, places where the earth between our world and another became thin, places where things could pass through. Sheriff Bolton wasn't superstitious by nature, but at that moment, standing in the center of that ruined camp, as the afternoon darkened around them, he couldn't find the words to dismiss what Wesley was saying. There was something deeply wrong with this place. The air seemed heavier, harder to breathe, and there was a subtle, almost imperceptible smell he couldn't quite place. Not rot exactly, but something like disturbed earth mixed with something sweet and nauseating. "We need to look for this cave mentioned in the notebooks," Bolton said finally, forcing his voice to sound steady. "The entry mentioned a cave 2 miles north with bones. If we're going to understand what happened here, we need to find it before it gets completely dark." Half the group protested. It was too late to begin searching for a cave in unfamiliar terrain. They should camp there and wait for dawn. But Bolton knew none of these men could sleep in that place, not after everything they had seen and read. And there was something inside him, some deep-seated investigative instinct, that told him they had to find that cave while they still had light. They split into 3 smaller groups to cover more ground. Each group had at least 7 men and carried flashlights and flares in case they found anything. Sheriff Bolton led the center group, heading directly north, using a compass he brought from his office. Mr. Henderson headed northwest, and a rancher named Caleb Winters led his group northeast. They agreed to fire 3 consecutive shots if they found anything significant. Bolton's group advanced through the dense forest, picking their way through snow-covered bushes and low-hanging branches that scratched their faces and clothing. Every 50 paces, Bolton stopped to check the compass and ensure they were heading north. The terrain began to rise, becoming rockier, and at several points, they had to climb ice-covered rock formations that made every step perilous. It was Wesley Drummond who first spotted the cave entrance. He stopped abruptly, raising his hand to signal the others. The opening was partially hidden by a curtain of ice, formed by the repeated melting and refreezing of water flowing from the rocks above. It measured perhaps 5 feet high and 7 feet wide, a black crevice in the face of a limestone cliff that rose 20 meters above them. Bolton fired 3 signal shots and waited. Minutes later, they heard the response. 3 distant shots from the northwest, confirming that Mr. Henderson's group was on their way, and 3 shots from the northeast indicated that Caleb Winters had also heard and was approaching. While waiting for the groups to reconvene, Bolton and his men approached the cave entrance. The smell they had noticed at the camp was much stronger here. That sweet, putrid odor wafted from the darkness of the cave like a fetid breath. One of the younger men, a 19-year-old named Michael, who worked at the Marshfield warehouse, turned and vomited violently into the snow. No one blamed him. Even the more experienced men were fighting their own nausea. By the time all 3 groups finally gathered in front of the cave, it was nearly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was touching the horizon, painting the clouds blood red and deep purple. They had, at most, 30 minutes of daylight left. Bolton turned on his flashlight and scanned the faces of the men around him. They all looked exhausted, scared, but determined. "Some of you should stay out here," he said. "Stand guard in case something goes wrong. I'm going in with 6 volunteers. I'm not going to force anyone to accompany me." To his surprise, more than 15 men volunteered immediately. Bolton chose the 6 who seemed calmest and most prepared, including Wesley Drummond and Mr. Henderson. The others remained outside, forming a defensive semicircle around the entrance, their weapons trained on the darkening forest around them. Bolton was the first to enter the cave, his lantern held high in front of him. The initial passage was narrow and low, forcing them to stoop as they advanced. The floor was uneven, covered in loose stones that rolled under their feet. The humidity in the air was oppressive, and their breath formed clouds of steam that danced in the yellow light of the lanterns. After about 20 meters, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Bolton raised his flashlight, and what he saw made his heart nearly stop. The cavern expanded into a chamber of impressive dimensions, the ceiling arching at least 10 meters high in some places. Stalactites hung like the teeth of some colossal creature, dripping water that echoed in absolute silence. But it wasn't the sheer grandeur of the formation that paralyzed Sheriff Bolton and his men. It was the bones that covered virtually every inch of the cavern floor. Bones, thousands of them. Some were stacked in neat mounds against the walls, separated by type skulls in one corner, long bones in another, ribs intertwined into structures that resembled macabre baskets. Others were scattered across the floor in patterns that suggested some ritual or decorative purpose. And in the center of the chamber stood a pile taller than all the others, a mound of remains so high it nearly reached the cavern's ceiling. Wesley Drummond crossed himself again, murmuring prayers his mother had taught him as a child. Mr. Henderson simply stood there, mouth agape, unable to process the magnitude of the horror before them. One of the other men, a lumberjack named Thomas Burke, fell to his knees and began to weep silently. Bolton forced his legs to move. He approached the nearest pile and crouched down to examine the bones more closely. Some were obviously ancient, yellowed with age, brittle to the touch, but others were alarmingly recent, still with fragments of tissue attached, still moist in places. He saw marks on the bones that confirmed what he had read in the notebooks. Teeth marks, deep grooves where something had gnawed at the flesh, cracks where bones had been broken to extract the marrow. But there was something more disturbing than that. Many of the bones showed signs of having been worked, intentionally modified femurs that had been sharpened to spear-like points, ribs that had been carved with the same strange symbols they'd seen on the piece of wood at the camp, skulls with precisely drilled holes, as if someone were making tools or ornaments from the remains of their victims. "How many people do you think are here?" Henderson asked in a shaky voice. Bolton looked around, trying to make a mental estimate. It was impossible to say for sure, but based on the volume of visible bones, he estimated the remains of at least 200, maybe 300 people in that cave. And considering that many of the bones appeared to be decades old, some perhaps centuries old. It suggested that whatever was happening in the Ozarks wasn't new. Something had been hunting people in these mountains for generations, perhaps centuries, and no one had ever discovered it or managed to stop it. As they explored deeper into the cave, they found even more disturbing evidence. There were secondary tunnels branching off the main chamber, some so narrow that a grown man could barely squeeze through them. Wesley ventured into one of these tunnels with his flashlight and returned moments later, his face as white as plaster. "There's more in there," he whispered. "Much more. And there's stuff that isn't bones. There are clothes, shoes, suitcases, watches, jewelry, hundreds of personal belongings, all stacked like someone was collecting trophies." Bolton knew they needed to document all of this, but he also knew time was fast running out. Outside, darkness had already fallen completely, and some deep primal instinct within him screamed that staying in that cave after dark would be a fatal mistake. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Now, let's gather the men outside and head back to Marshfield. Tomorrow, when it's full daylight, we'll return with more people, maybe even with state aid. But we can't stay here overnight." No one disagreed. They turned to return through the narrow passage that had brought them here. But then, something stopped them all in their tracks. A sound, faint at first, barely audible, but gradually growing in volume and clarity. It came from one of the side tunnels, from the depths of the cavern where their flashlights couldn't reach. It was a voice, a human voice, female, singing softly. "Nobody move," Bolton ordered in an urgent whisper. All 6 men froze, their flashlights trembling in hands that suddenly couldn't hold still. The voice continued, the melody becoming clearer. It was an ancient lullaby, something mothers had sung to their children for generations. But there was something wrong with it, something that made their skin crawl and their stomachs churn. The timbre was slightly distorted, as if the singer were imitating a human voice, but couldn't quite get it right. The words were correct, but the rhythm was mechanical, artificial, and there were strange echoes, as if multiple voices were singing slightly out of sync with each other. "Margaret," Mr. Henderson whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "That's Margaret Sullivan's voice. I recognize it from the time she sang in church." Bolton felt his blood run cold. Margaret Sullivan, the teacher who had disappeared just 3 days earlier, the woman whose necklace they had found at the abandoned camp. Was she alive, trapped somewhere deep in that cave? Or was something using her voice, imitating her to lure them deeper into the darkness? The song stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. And then, from the same direction the voice had come from, they heard other sounds. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, slowly approaching. But there was something off about their rhythm, something not quite human. It was as if whoever was walking toward them had forgotten how to walk properly, as if they were relearning the movement after a long time without using it. "Run," Bolton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Run now." They didn't need to be told twice. The 7 men ran toward the exit, their flashlights swinging wildly, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Behind them, the footsteps quickened, now accompanied by other sounds. Wet, labored breathing, the drag of something heavy being pulled across the stone floor, and voices. Multiple voices, all imitating different people, calling the names of the fleeing men. Bolton heard his own mother calling his name, her voice exactly as he remembered it from his childhood in Illinois before she died of pneumonia 10 years earlier. Wesley Drummond sobbed aloud when he heard the voice of his daughter, who had died in childbirth 3 winters ago, begging her father not to leave her alone in the dark. Mr. Henderson stumbled when he heard all 4 members of the Brennan family calling out to him simultaneously, their voices overlapping in an impossible, sickening cacophony. The narrow passage that would lead them back to the exit seemed to have lengthened, as if the cave itself were expanding to keep them trapped. Bolton knew it was impossible. That fear was distorting his perception. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running in place, that they would never reach the opening to the open air and the relative safety of the forest. Thomas Burke, the woodcutter who had wept at the sight of the bones, was the last of the group. He glanced back for a moment, just a brief moment of hesitation, and his flashlight illuminated something that made his scream echo off the stone walls. Figures emerging from the darkness, tall, slender, moving with that unnatural gait they had heard. Their silhouettes were vaguely humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, dangling almost to the ground, heads tilted at impossible angles, and their faces, when the flickering light caught them for a split second, looked like ill-fitting masks of the human form, their features stretched and distorted like melted wax. Burke's scream gave the others the adrenaline needed for one last, desperate push. They emerged from the cave entrance, stumbling, falling into the snow, some with tears freezing on their faces. The men who had stood guard outside immediately raised their weapons, aiming at the dark opening. "Don't shoot!" Bolton shouted, raising his hands. "Everyone get out! We're all here!" But as he spoke, he realized with growing horror that he was wrong. He counted quickly. Himself, Wesley, Henderson, the man who had become ill upon seeing the cave, another who had volunteered 5 men. There should have been 7. 2 were missing. "Where's Thomas Burke?" Henderson asked, also noticing his absence. "And Michael, the boy from the warehouse?" Everyone turned to look at the cave entrance. Nothing emerged from the darkness. No sound came from within. The silence was absolute and ominous. Bolton took a step toward the opening, his sense of duty warring with his survival instinct, but Wesley grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "They're gone, Sheriff," the old farmer said in a choked voice. "You know they're gone, and if we go in after them, we won't be coming back either. We have to get out of these mountains while we still can." Bolton wanted to argue, wanted to rally the men and make a rescue attempt. But looking into the eyes of the men around him, he saw only absolute terror. They had reached the limit of what they could bear, and in a deep part of his mind, he knew Wesley was right. Thomas Burke and Michael were beyond help now. The assembled group began their hurried descent from the mountain, leaving the cave behind. There were 21 men now, 2 fewer than when they had arrived. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and their flashlights provided only faint circles of yellow light that barely penetrated the absolute darkness of the forest. The way back seemed much longer and much more dangerous than the way up. They hadn't descended even 500 meters when they heard it for the first time. A whistle, low, drawn out, coming from the forest to their left, then another responding from the right, and another behind them, coming from the direction of the cave. These weren't natural sounds. No forest animal whistled like that, with that almost human but fundamentally wrong cadence. The men instinctively gathered together, forming a tight group as they continued descending. Bolton ordered them to keep their flashlights raised and their weapons ready. No one was to separate from the group for any reason. No one was to respond if they heard their name called, no matter how familiar the voice sounded. But following these instructions proved more difficult than anyone had imagined. The voices began soon after, at first sporadic, then increasing in frequency and urgency. Wives calling out to their husbands, children pleading with their parents, friends who had died years before, chatting casually as if nothing had happened. The voices came from all directions, moving through the trees, always out of the reach of light, but close enough to be heard with disturbing clarity. One of the younger men, a 24-year-old farmer named Joseph Reed, began to walk away from the group, his eyes fixed on something in the trees that only he seemed to see. "Sarah," he called softly. "Sarah, is that you? I can see you, love. Wait for me." 3 men grabbed him before he could walk into the darkness. Joseph fought them, tears streaming down his face, crying out the name of his wife, who had died during an influenza epidemic 2 years earlier. "She's right there, can't you see? She's waiting for me. Let me go." Bolton had to slap Joseph hard across the face to bring him back to reality. The young man blinked in confusion, looking around as if waking from a dream. I saw her," he whispered. "It was so real. She was smiling at me." "It wasn't her," Bolton said firmly, gripping Joseph's shoulders. "Whatever you saw, it wasn't your wife. Understand? We need to keep moving." But the incident with Joseph seemed to have emboldened whatever was following them. The voices became more insistent, more convincing, and then they began to see things. Figures among the trees, always at the edge of vision, always disappearing when someone turned their head directly to look. Shadows moving against the wind. Silhouettes that seemed human at first glance, but revealed impossible proportions upon closer inspection. The descent turned into a desperate escape. The men stumbled over roots hidden by the snow, slipped on ice-covered rocks, but never stopped completely. Stopping meant giving the things in the forest time to get closer, and they all felt with a visceral and terrifying certainty that if something caught them, it would be the end. Wesley Drummond, despite his 56 years, remained near the front of the group, his mountain experience guiding them along the safest paths, but even he was visibly shaken. Bolton noticed the old farmer muttering constantly, prayers and pleas in a mixture of English and something older, words that might have been from indigenous languages his grandfather had taught him decades ago. It was then that the first attack happened. One of the men at the rear of the group, a miner named Frank Collins, screamed as something grabbed him by the ankle. He fell heavily into the snow, his flashlight rolling away and going out. Before anyone could react, he was being dragged backward into the darkness between the trees, his fingers digging desperate grooves in the snow as he tried to find something to hold on to. 5 men rushed to help him, grabbing his arms and pulling in the opposite direction. For a terrifying moment, it was like a tug of war with an invisible, incredibly strong force. Frank screamed incessantly, not in pain, but in sheer terror. "Don't let me go. Please, God, don't let me go." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the force pulling him simply released. The men fell back in a tangled heap, Frank still among them. But when Bolton raised his flashlight to examine the miner, his stomach churned. Frank's left leg from the shin down was completely covered in marks, deep scratches, as if fingers with sharp nails had dug into his flesh through his thick woolen trousers. And there was something else, a sweet, putrid odor permeating his clothing, the same smell they had smelled in the Cave of Bones. Frank was in shock, shaking uncontrollably. 2 men lifted him, placing his arms over their shoulders to help him walk. The group resumed their descent, this time even faster, bordering on total panic. But the attack had established a pattern. Over the next 40 minutes of terrifying descent, there were 3 more attempts to drag men from the group. Each time, the others managed to hold them, pulling them back to the relative safety of the lantern's circle of light. But each attack left its victims scarred, scratched, and impregnated with that horrible smell that seemed to attract even more attention from the things in the forest. Bolton noticed the pattern. The creatures were testing them, learning their defenses, waiting for the moment when the group's guard would drop or someone would get separated. They were intelligent, patient, and utterly relentless. Worse, the sheriff had the growing feeling they weren't just dealing with 1 or 2 creatures. From the sounds in the woods, the multiple voices, the coordinated attempts to separate members of the group, there were dozens of them out there in the darkness, maybe hundreds. When they finally reached the abandoned camp where it had all begun hours earlier, it was nearly midnight. The men were exhausted, several wounded, all traumatized beyond anything they had ever experienced. Bolton gathered them in the center of the clearing, their backs to each other, weapons pointed in all directions. "We still have at least 2 hours to walk to Marshfield," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "But we can't stop. If we do, they'll catch us. We have to keep going, no matter how tired we are." But as he spoke, something in the trees surrounding the clearing caught his attention. Lights, tiny specks of pale luminescence, like fireflies. But it was deep winter. There were no insects. The lights moved among the trees, swaying gently, drawing closer, and with them came the voices again, but this time all singing in unison, that same lullaby they had heard in the cave, that voice imitating Margaret Sullivan. The lights multiplied, dozens of them, then hundreds, forming a complete circle around the clearing. And then, for the first time, Bolton could clearly see what was chasing them. They were human, or had once been, human skeletal figures dressed in rags, their skin stretched over bones like yellowed parchment. Their faces were masks of eternal hunger, open mouths showing teeth that had been sharpened to points, eyes sunken in their sockets, but still glowing with a sickly yellow light. Some carried the remains of those they had captured, bones they used as tools or weapons. Others simply crouched at the edges of the clearing, watching with uncanny patience. And in the center of the circle of creatures, illuminated by those spectral lights, stood a figure that made Bolton's heart nearly stop. It was Margaret Sullivan, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale as snow, her eyes empty and dead. She still wore the dress she had worn the day of her disappearance, but now it was torn and stained. And when she opened her mouth to sing again, Bolton saw that her teeth had been ripped out and replaced with sharp points of bone, brutally implanted into her bleeding gums. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't alive anymore either. Not in the way that mattered. She had become one of them. "Fire!" Bolton ordered, his voice cracking. "Fire at anything that moves!" The silence of the forest exploded with deafening booms as 21 guns fired simultaneously. The creatures scattered, moving with supernatural speed, disappearing into the trees. But not before Bolton saw several fall, their twisted bodies riddled with bullets. To his horror, even mortally wounded, some continued to crawl, still trying to reach the group of men, their mouths open in silent screams of insatiable hunger. The men reloaded with trembling hands, their fingers numb from cold and fear, making each movement painfully slow. Bolton knew they didn't have enough ammunition for a prolonged confrontation. Each man had brought perhaps 30 or 40 rounds at most. If the creatures decided to attack all at once en masse, it would be a massacre. "Form a column," he shouted. "Let's break through their circle and run. It's our only chance." It was a desperate gamble, but standing still meant certain death. The group quickly reorganized into a tight formation. The strongest men on the flanks and front, the wounded protected in the center. Wesley Drummond took the lead, guiding them in what he believed to be the most direct route to Marshfield. They advanced like a spear through the darkness, darting sideways whenever they saw movement. The creatures followed, keeping their distance, but never retreating completely. It was like being stalked by a pack of hungry wolves, waiting for their prey to stumble, for the formation to break, for someone to fall behind. And then the fog began to form. It appeared out of nowhere, condensing between the trees, as if the forest itself were exhaling thick, white. It swallowed the light from their flashlights, reducing visibility to a few meters. The men drew closer, some literally holding onto the clothes of the person in front of them to avoid getting lost. The mist smelled strange, not just damp, but organic, like graveyard dirt and decaying flowers. In the opaque whiteness, the creatures' voices seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. And now, they weren't just imitating the dead. They began to imitate the living, perfectly replicating the voices of the men in the group themselves. Bolton heard his own voice calling from somewhere to the right, telling the group to follow him that way. Mr. Henderson sobbed when he heard the voice of his son, Daniel, the one who had found the missing teacher, shouting that he was lost and needed help. "Don't listen," Bolton ordered, his real voice competing with the demonic imitation. "Keep moving. Follow Wesley." But the fog was thickening, and even Wesley was beginning to waver, unsure if they were still heading in the right direction. The trees all looked the same, now black silhouettes, emerging from the whiteness like ghosts. The ground beneath their feet became treacherous, shrouded in mist, so that they couldn't see where they were going. It was Joseph Reed, the young farmer who had nearly been seduced by the apparitions earlier, who slipped first. His scream echoed through the fog as his foot met empty air instead of solid ground. He had stepped onto the edge of a cliff, hidden by fog and darkness. Two men grabbed his arms at the last second, pulling him back to safety. But the incident forced the group to stop and regroup. And in that moment of hesitation, the creatures attacked. They came from all directions at once, emerging from the mist like nightmares come to life, their claws extended, their mouths open, baring those horrific teeth, their eyes glowing with hunger and something that seemed terrifyingly close to malignant intelligence. The attack was coordinated, brutal, and nearly successful. Frank Collins, the miner who had been the first to be grabbed, was ripped from the group before anyone could react. His outstretched hand reached desperately for Bolton, his fingers brushing the sheriff's for a split second before he was pulled into the mist. His scream lasted only a few seconds before it was abruptly cut off, replaced by wet, terrible sounds neither man would ever forget. Caleb Winters, the farmer who had led one of the search parties for the cave, fired his rifle point blank into the face of a creature grabbing him. The blast momentarily illuminated the fog, revealing for a horrifying instant the full extent of their surroundings. There were dozens of them, perhaps 50 or more, a tight circle of starving, twisted bodies pressing ever closer. "Run!" Wesley Drummond shouted, abandoning any pretense of order or formation. "Go!" The group disintegrated. Men ran blindly through the fog, some in small groups, others completely alone. Bolton tried to keep the people together, shouting for them to regroup, but his voice was lost in the chaos of screams, gunfire, and the horrific sounds of the creatures stalking their prey. He ran alongside Wesley and Mr. Henderson, his lungs burning in the cold air, his legs like lead. Behind them, more screams rose, and then fell silent. Each silence meant another man lost, another life consumed by the darkness of those cursed mountains. The fog began to lift as abruptly as it had appeared. Suddenly, Bolton could see again, and what he saw brought a glimmer of desperate hope. Lights ahead, not the spectral lights of the creatures, but warm yellow lights from lanterns and window structures, houses. They had reached the first farms on the outskirts of Marshfield. The three men ran toward the lights with their last reserves of energy. Behind them, the creatures paused at the edge of the retreating fog, as if there were an invisible line they could not or would not cross. But Bolton knew the truth. They were not giving up. They were simply waiting for the next opportunity, the next night, the next travelers foolish enough to venture into the Ozark forests after dark. When they finally stumbled onto Marshfield's main street, the sky beginning to lighten with the first gray hues of dawn, Bolton counted the survivors. Himself, Wesley, Henderson, plus 4 men who had arrived by other routes. 7. Only 7 of the 23 who had set out the previous morning. 16 men lay dead or missing in those mountains, and Bolton knew with a sickening certainty that they would never find their bodies. They would become just more bones in the cave, More names whispered by the creatures to lure future victims. More unsolved mysteries in the dark chronicles of the Ozarks. Sheriff Henry Bolton didn't sleep that night, or the next, sitting in his office as the sun rose over Marshfield. He wrote the most important and impossible report of his career. His hands shook as he held the pen, smearing the paper with ink blots as he tried to describe what they had found in that cave, what had chased them through the woods, what had taken 16 good men. How could he write the truth? That creatures that were once human roamed the mountains hunting the living. That Margaret Sullivan, the respected teacher, had been transformed into something monstrous in just 3 days. That hundreds of people had disappeared over decades, perhaps centuries, their bones piled in a cave as offerings to some ancient, insatiable hunger. He knew how it would sound. Mad, delusional. The tale of a man who had lost his sanity in the cold and fear of the mountains. No one would believe it, and even if they did, what could be done? How many armed men would it take to clear those mountains? 100, 200, and how many of them would come back alive? Bolton finally put down his pen and buried his face in his hands. Tears burned his eyes for the first time since he was a child. 16 families now waited for news he couldn't deliver. 16 wives who would become widows. Children who would grow up without fathers. Mothers who would bury their children's memories without ever having a body to lay in the ground. The office door opened, and Wesley Drummond walked in, looking as if he had aged a decade in a single night. The old farmer carried a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He placed them on Bolton's desk without a word, filled both to the brim, and handed one to the sheriff. "What are we drinking for, friend?" Wesley asked hoarsely. "For the dead," Bolton replied, "and for those who wish they were dead after what they saw." They drank in silence for several minutes. Outside, Marshfield was beginning to wake up. People were opening their shops. Children were running through the snow-covered streets. Life was going on, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for the 7 men who survived that night in the mountains. "They'll want answers," Wesley said finally. "The families, the community. We can't just say 16 men disappeared without a trace." "I know," Bolton said, "but what answer can I give? The truth would make me look crazy. A lie would dishonor the dead." Wesley looked out the window at the distant mountains, their silhouettes outlined against the brightening sky. "My grandfather told me a story when I was a boy," he began slowly, "about what the ancient people here called Wendigos. He said they were humans who had committed the sin of eating the flesh of their own kind. Afterward, they could never be satisfied. They transformed into something between man and monster, doomed to wander the forests eternally hungry, growing thinner and thinner, no matter how much they ate." Bolton turned to look at the old farmer. "You think this is it? Cannibals who have transformed into some kind of creature?" "I think this land has a memory," Wesley said thoughtfully. "The Ozarks are ancient, Sheriff, much older than any of us, and there are places in these mountains where terrible things have happened over the centuries. Massacres, famines, desperation that drove people to do unthinkable things just to survive another day. Maybe that cave is one of those places, a place where evil has become so concentrated that it has become something alive, something contagious." "So, what do we do?" Bolton asked. "How do we stop this?" Wesley shook his head slowly. "I don't know if we can stop it, but we can warn. We can make sure no one else enters those woods after dark. We can make sure every traveler, every family knows that there's something waiting out there in the darkness, something that can't be easily killed, something that will keep hunting as long as there are people foolish enough to venture into its territory." Over the next few hours, the survivors began to gather. Mr. Henderson arrived with Joseph Reed, both still visibly traumatized. The other 4 men who had survived appeared one by one, each carrying the weight of what they had witnessed in their empty eyes. They sat in the small sheriff's office and together formed a story. It wasn't entirely untrue. They would say they were attacked by a group of savage mountain men who had established their territory in the deepest reaches of the Ozarks. That these men were cannibals, psychotic, dangerous beyond description. That they tried to rescue their victims but were outnumbered and forced to retreat. That 16 good men died trying to protect their community from a threat no one realized until it was too late. It was a story people could believe. It was less horrific than the truth, but horrific enough to serve as a warning. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to keep people away from those forests until whatever lived there finally starved to death or returned to whatever primal darkness it had emerged from. Bolton drafted the official report in this version. He sent telegrams to state authorities in Jefferson City, asking for help, tracking down the criminals responsible for the murders. He knew no real help would come. The state had bigger problems in 1912, and the Ozarks had always been considered wilderness, a place where the law rarely reached. But he did one more thing, something he knew violated his duty as a law enforcement officer, but which his survival instinct demanded. He gathered all the notebooks they had found at the abandoned camp, all the disturbing objects recovered, and burned them completely. He reduced them to ashes in a fire pit behind his office, watching as those insane notes and ancient symbols were consumed by the flames. If other investigators came, if other people decided to explore those mountains, they wouldn't have the clues that would lead directly to the cave. They wouldn't know where to look. And maybe, just maybe, this would save some lives, or at least delay more deaths until better prepared people with more resources could deal with what lurked in those dark depths. As the ash rose into the cold morning air, Wesley Drummond stood beside Bolton. "Did we do the right thing?" the old farmer asked. "I don't know," Bolton admitted. "But it was the only thing we could do." The months following that terrible night in December 1912 were marked by a heavy silence that settled over Webster County like an invisible shroud. The families of the 16 missing men held funerals without bodies, burying empty coffins in somber ceremonies where few could look each other in the eye. Everyone knew something was wrong with the official story, but no one had the courage to question the 7 survivors who returned from that expedition with blank stares and nightmares that made them scream in their sleep. Sheriff Bolton remained in office, but he was a shadow of his former self. He began drinking heavily, something everyone in town pretended not to notice. His wife Sarah, who lived in Springfield and rarely visited him due to the distance, noticed the change when she came to Marshfield in February. She found a prematurely aged man with hair that had turned gray at the temples practically overnight, and hands that trembled whenever the sun began to set. Wesley Drummond sold his farm in March and moved to Kansas City, telling his family he needed a fresh start after the tragedy. But the truth was he couldn't sleep knowing those mountains were so close, that those creatures still roamed the forests just a few miles away. He spent the last years of his life in a small house in the city, steadfastly refusing to visit any place with dense trees or deep darkness. Mr. Henderson was never the same. He continued living on his farm outside Hartville, but he completely stopped traveling after dark. His son Daniel noticed that his father had installed new locks on all the doors and windows, had a high wall built around the property, and kept lanterns lit in every room of the house all night. When Daniel asked why, his father simply looked at him with haunted eyes and said, "So they can see we're always awake, always vigilant, always ready." Joseph Reed, the young farmer who had nearly been seduced by apparitions of his dead wife, abandoned rural life altogether. He moved to St. Louis and never returned to the Ozarks. Years later, when a cousin found him working in a shoe factory in the city, Joseph explained simply, There are worse things than urban poverty. There are things that live where men should not live, in places where civilization has not yet reached and perhaps never should reach. But the most profound impact was felt by the Ozarks themselves. The story spread, distorted, and amplified with each iteration. Travelers began to avoid certain routes through the mountains altogether. Families who had lived on isolated farms for generations began moving to larger communities, seeking the safety of numbers and light. Traffic on the roads that cut through the deepest parts of the forest dwindled dramatically. Those who absolutely had to travel these routes did so only during the brightest hours of the day, setting out at dawn and ensuring they would reach their destination long before dark. The Cave of Bones was never officially found again. Bolton had burned all the notes indicating its location, and the survivors made a silent pact never to reveal its location. A few people tried searching for it in the years that followed, curious explorers and thrill-seekers drawn by the whispered stories. Most returned empty-handed. Some never returned at all, adding their names to the long list of the Ozarks missing. There were more disappearances in the following years, of course. Not as many as before, now that people were more cautious. But they still happened. A lone traveler who decided to camp near a stream in July 1913. A family who had trouble with their wagon and was forced to spend the night in the woods in October of the same year. A group of 3 hunters in November 1914 who ventured too deep into the mountains chasing a deer and never returned. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: belongings left behind intact, footprints leading into the forest, and then abruptly disappearing. No body ever recovered. And always, there were reports of voices the night before, of strange lights among the trees, of figures seen on the periphery of vision that vanished when directly observed. Sheriff Bolton kept meticulous records of each case, filling notebooks with details he never shared with anyone else. He developed maps showing where each disappearance had occurred, looking for patterns, trying to understand the boundaries of the creature's territory. He noticed that the disappearances were more frequent during the winter months, when the nights were longer and the cold was more intense. He noticed that they seemed to concentrate in a specific area of the mountains, an irregular circle perhaps 30 miles in diameter, centered approximately where he believed the Cave of Bones was located. But he never returned to that area. He never organized another expedition. He never attempted to confront what lived in those depths again. He had learned the hard way that some things are best left alone, that there are battles that cannot be won, only avoided. In 1918, Henry Bolton resigned as sheriff. He cited health problems, but everyone knew it was something deeper. He moved to Columbia, Missouri, where he got a job as a night watchman at a school. He spent his final years in relative peace, though those who knew him said he never really slept, spending his nights walking the school hallways with a flashlight, checking doors and windows, always vigilant against something only he could see. He died in 1929 at the age of 57 of a heart attack. His last request was to be cremated. He didn't want to be buried in the ground, didn't want his bones to remain in the earth where those things could find them. His notebooks, all those meticulous records of disappearances and patterns, were found in his home after his death. His daughter read them, was horrified, and burned them just as her father had burned the notebooks found at the camp 17 years earlier. The story of the events of December 1912 gradually became a local legend. People still tell versions of it in the Ozarks, especially during the long winter months when the nights are dark and the wind howls through the mountains. The details have changed over the decades, exaggerated or softened depending on the teller, but the core of the story remains. There is something in those mountains, something ancient and hungry, something that was once human, but is no longer. Something that waits patiently in the shadows for travelers foolish enough to venture into its territory after sunset. And to this day, More than a century after those terrible events, the locals of the Ozarks follow certain unwritten rules. Don't travel alone on remote roads. Don't camp in isolated areas. Never answer if you hear your name being called in the woods at night. And above all, if you find yourself deep in the Ozarks as the sun begins to set, run. Run fast. Run without looking back. And pray you reach civilization before darkness falls completely. Because in the forests of the Ozarks, when night falls, you're no longer at the top of the food chain. And if something starts following you, if you hear voices imitating people you love, if you see strange lights dancing among the trees, it might already be too late. The creatures are patient. They've learned over centuries, and they're always waiting for their next meal, for the next traveler who couldn't reach safety before the darkness swallowed them. The Cave of Bones is still there somewhere in those mountains, waiting. And from time to time, adventurous hikers or curious explorers disappear in that region, adding more names to the endless list of unsolved mysteries of the Ozarks. Their families wait for answers that will never come, for bodies that will never be found. And on the darkest, coldest nights of winter, if you listen closely enough, they say you can still hear that lullaby being sung deep in the woods, that voice that perfectly imitates someone you loved, calling you to join those who never escaped. This is the disturbing story of why you should never seek help after dark in the wilds of the Ozarks. It's a warning written in the blood of 16 good men who tried to confront the evil that lurks in those mountains. It's a testament to the fragility of civilization, to how thin the veneer is that separates us from the primal darkness that still exists in the forgotten corners of our world. If this story gave you chills, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more disturbing mysteries and cases that defy explanation. Share in the comments if you've ever had any strange experiences in forests or isolated places. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying stories are those that carry a kernel of truth, the ones that remind us that there are still things in the world we don't fully understand, things that perhaps are best left in the dark places where they belong.